The Departed is a 2006 crime thriller directed by Martin Scorsese, and it came out about 18, 19 years ago. And in my opinion, it's one of the best movies I've ever personally seen, right? I would put it up there with some of the best film of all time, right? And this is no controversial statement to make, right? I'm sure a lot of people who have watched this film would agree, right, that it's a masterpiece. There's a lot of great themes in it, like the themes of duality, identity, manipulation, and death. But the ones I'm going to be talking about, on this video are the themes of loyalty, ego, and looking past the surface and using specific examples from the film to try to illustrate the points I want to make, right? So this should go without saying that there is going to be spoilers in this video, right? So if you haven't seen the film, I would urge you to stop listening to the video, go watch the movie and then come back to the video, because you definitely don't want to get any spoilers for this movie. Because like I said, it's a masterpiece. If there's one thing that is just permeating the film, all throughout, is this constant sense of impending, I guess anxiety, just anxiety, suspense, and, not knowing what's going to really happen next, right? So I would say that's a core element of the film. So without further ado, I'm just going to be talking about the first theme that I really got from this film, right? And that's the theme of loyalty. All throughout the film, you have all these characters who are supposed to be in these organizations, right? Like the police department and the mob, that, a central tenet of these organizations should be loyalty, right? Having each other's backs, really trusting one another, and not having to worry about, issues like that could potentially arise from people within your own organization, right? But funny enough, that's the complete opposite of what actually happens in these organizations, right? There's a lot of backstabbing, there's a lot of two-facedness, there's just a lot of inauthenticity, right? Or unauthenticity from a lot of the characters, right? You could argue that the only true loyalty that's displayed in the film is the dynamic between Queenan, Dignam, and Billy, right? That's where honest authenticity and loyalty is, truly displayed. You can also argue that, the mob boss Costello and his right-hand man had a sense of loyalty to one another, but, the purity of it and just I guess integrity of it is not comparable to the dynamic that Dignam, Queenan, and Billy had, right? Even though Dignam and Billy didn't get along too well on the surface, even though Dignam wasn't a very likable character in general, at the end of the day he displayed true loyalty, right, by getting revenge on Sullivan and getting revenge for Queenan and Billy, right? I'm sure, that tied into his decision to take matters into his own hands at the end of the film, right? Instead of leaving the job for somebody else. And this can be applied to in real life, right? Even though you're surrounded by a lot of people that you may think are your friends, even though you may have people, being super nice to you and smiling to you in your face, true loyalty, authenticity, and friendship is really hard to find, at least in my personal experience, right? Not everybody you meet, not everybody that you seem to get along with really has your best interests in mind, or, you can't be too quick to call somebody a friend, right? A good way to figure out who really has your back, through thick and thin, is when times get tough, right? When times get tough, when you need help, when you're down and out, right? The people that stick by your side no matter what, through the good and bad, those are the people that you should really cherish, and that you can, genuinely call friends and family, right? So again, just be careful on who you decide to trust and who you place your loyalties on, right? Another example that shows this theme is when Sullivan's so-called friend from the academy, right, the second rat that Costello had in the department, is end up being betrayed by Sullivan, right? So again, if you're familiar with the film, you know that Sullivan's friend comes to his aid. Again, friend, quote unquote, right? He comes to his aid and takes out Billy, right, when Sullivan was just about to be taken over to the police department. and apprehended, he's basically caught, and this guy comes to Billy, or to Sullivan's rescue. He ends up giving this this speech about how, oh, we need to have each other's backs, right? I have your back, you have my back, or something along those lines, right? And again, this guy foolishly thinks that Sullivan is his friend, right? Just because he helped him out, and because he gave him a promotion, that somehow these two are buddies, right? But Sullivan doesn't care. He ends up taking him out, right? Just tying any other loose ends that may get him in trouble, right? So again, this is just another clear example of how people can foolishly just, believe that just because somebody on paper seems to have your best interest in mind, right? Or it may appear to be like you guys are friends, that the reality of things may be completely different, right? There's a lot of manipulative, two-faced people out there, right? And you can't really know somebody's intentions just from a little bit of time, right? So always, again, take your time to really get to know people, and don't be too quick to trust or put your trust in people, right? That's not to say that you should live in a state of paranoia or just constant skepticism. It just means to just be logical about things, and really take your time to know people and to understand situations, right? To not jump to conclusions too quickly. So the second theme that I want to talk about is the theme of ego, right? And how it can lead to your downfall. There's one specific example that immediately comes to mind, and that is when Billy ends up getting killed right towards the end of the film. So ego is defined as identity, right? Your own self-image, the image that you have of yourself, right? And pride can be, I guess, a subcategory of ego, right? And how it can definitely lead to negative consequences if you operate from that sort of place, right? If you operate from a place of pride or ego in general, how emotions in general can lead to your downfall, right? And again, I'm going to use the specific example of Billy, right? So again, towards the end of the film, Billy pretty much has Sullivan in wraps, right? He is about to take him into the police department, and you can imagine all the accolades and all the awards that Billy was going to get for figuring out who the rat was, right? Not only that, he has solid evidence, and the ball's in his court, right, basically. But he ends up getting killed because of this. In my personal opinion, it would have been the most logical, reasonable thing to have done at that point was to just leave it to somebody else, right? To leave the job to somebody else, because there was just too much heat surrounding his characters, right? His and Sullivan's characters. Their identities had been exposed. Just the danger level was at an all-time high. So the most logical, reasonable thing to have done, right? You have evidence. You have everything you need to put Sullivan away. The most reasonable thing to have done was to just leave it to somebody else, right? To leave town for a bit and to basically get away from all the madness that was surrounding you, right? But again, you can't really blame Billy for trying to get something out of the whole ordeal, right? Since the beginning of the film, he had been under constant stress. He was battling all sorts of things. So you can't really blame the guy for wanting a little bit of glory at the end, right? But again, his emotions, his ego, you can say, got the better of him, wanting, I'm sure that was part of his motivation to bring in Sullivan himself, right? The accolades, the awards, perhaps even the promotions that he would have gotten, right? Money wise as well, right? All these things combined, I'm sure that was part of his motivation to personally bring in Sullivan, right? But again, a lot of the times when you operate from ego or emotion, it doesn't tend to pan out too well, right? So again, the clear example is what Billy's death in this film. He ends up getting killed because of his actions. The opposite, I've personally found, is also true, right? When you operate from a place of humility, good results tend to come, right? The opposite is also true. In my opinion, it's also a balancing act, right? Dealing with the ego, having too little or too much of it, I don't think is a good thing, right? It's more of a balance and more of a balancing act, and just using what's necessary, I guess. And lastly, if you made it this far in the video, thank you so much for listening. The last thing I'm going to talk about is, the theme of looking past the surface level and, diving deeper into things. taking that extra step to again look past the surface and analyze things much more deeply, right? To truly get an understanding of a situation or of a person, right? So there's a lot of points throughout the film where Billy's identity, for example, had been questioned, right? Whether it was by the mob boss himself, Costello, or by one of his henchmen, right? There are multiple times throughout the film, right, where random characters like that would just be sitting down with Billy or just talking to him, right? And questioning his allegiance and his loyalty and having questions about his character in general, right? Even Costello himself questioned whether he was the rat or not, right, directly. But thanks to Billy's wonderful acting, right, his charisma and his ability to talk to people, he's able to convince the people that are questioning him, that he was actually loyal, right, that he wasn't the rat. If these characters would have just gone that extra step to make sure that their suspicions were not warranted, right? That they were just not coming from a place of reason. If they would have just taken those extra steps to really make sure that Billy wasn't the rat, I'm sure that he would have found out a lot sooner. Of course, a lot of this was just done for plot reasons, right? It is a movie after all, but if this was actually happening in real life, you can see how things would pan out. And it's a clear example of just taking things past the surface level, right? A lot of the time, people who are overly charismatic or are good with talking to people or just have that charisma and high energy about them, right? Those people tend to be well liked, at least from personal observation, right? But it's also true, at least in my experience, that a lot of those people, those people that display those characteristics tend to be completely different people, right? When you really get to know them, or when, they tend to expose themselves, right, as something completely opposite to what they present. That's not to say that, every super charismatic, high energy, good with talking with others person, is somehow a two-faced liar or something like that. No, that's definitely not the case. But again, from personal experience, I can say that people that display those characteristics tend to be this way. Again, you can also say the same thing about Sullivan, and I love the duality, theme of this movie. For what you can say for one side, you can also apply to the other in a lot of times. And again, the same thing could be said about Sullivan's character, right? Just the super charismatic, good at talking to people, well liked by others, right? But there's a few characters that always have their suspicions about him, right? In particularly Dignam, right? He doesn't get along with him, in the few interactions that he does have with him. And again, the same thing could be said about Dignam if he just took those extra steps to make sure that, Sullivan wasn't up to anything, suspicious. If he would have just, put a tail on him or tapped his phone or, just gone along with his gut instinct, right? But because you can see that Dignam really does have questions about his character in general, right? So I'm sure Sullivan would have found out a lot sooner. Looking past the surface level character that, these people presented and, really taking the time to understand them, right? I'll give you one last example. Dignam's character, on the surface, he appears to be just this a-hole who doesn't get along with anybody, right? That doesn't seem to be very likable or approachable, right? But it turns out in reality, he was a super loyal guy, right? And that, he was actually one of the few authentic people in the entire, in the entire film. He ends up getting revenge again for Queenan and Billy's deaths when he could have easily just let somebody else do the dirty work, handle Sullivan, right? Somebody else could have handled that situation, but again, he displays a, element of loyalty, by his actions. Even though, most of the scenes that, we get of Dignam throughout the film, again, just show him to be this kind of, unlikable person, unlikable character, right? So, again, it just goes back to what I said earlier, and really taking the time to understand people and a situation and not jumping to conclusions too quickly, right? So, do your own thinking. Don't believe everything you see or hear. or just because it's presented a certain way or it's presented from a quote-unquote official source, right? Nowadays a lot of people are just completely brainwashed by what they see on television, right? If they see it on television or they see it on the news, they immediately assume that it must be true, right? Because it's being presented by these official looking channels or official sources, quote unquote. But always, again, do your own research and don't draw conclusions too quickly, right? Draw your own conclusions after you have made your own research, right? But how many of us actually do that, right? So let me know your thoughts on the film. What did you think about it? What did you think about the characters, the themes? I would love to hear your thoughts on the film in general, right? If you're new to the channel, thank you so much for watching. I make videos on topics that fascinate me, whether it be a movie like this, like The Departed, or an anime, a TV show, anything that fascinates me in general. I occasionally also try to give life advice based on personal experience that, hopefully help somebody out there. Thank you to all the subscribers and viewers of this channel, and I'll see you guys in the next one.